I'm Annabel Marcus, 28, and 7 months pregnant with my first child. 3 days ago, my parents threw me out of the house I grew up in, calling me an embarrassment to the family name. The reason? I refused to marry the man they chose for me, the father of my baby who abandoned us both. Standing on their doorstep with my suitcase and growing belly, I thought I'd lost everything. But today, they showed up at my small apartment with lawyers and demands I never saw coming. They want my baby, the same child they called a shameful mistake, just 72 hours earlier. What I discovered about their true motives would shatter everything I believed about family, love, and the lengths people go to protect their secrets. Sometimes, the people who hurt you most are the ones who raised you. 3 days ago, I sat across from my parents at our mahogany dining table, the same table where I'd eaten countless family dinners, celebrated birthdays, and received lectures about my potential. But this conversation was different. This one would change everything. My mother, Margaret Marcus, sat perfectly composed in her pressed blazer, her graying hair pulled back in that familiar tight bun. My father, Marcus Sr., drummed his fingers against the wood, a nervous habit he'd developed over the years of running Marcus Industries into the ground, though I didn't know that part yet. Annabel, my mother began, her voice carrying that particular tone of disappointment I'd grown up hearing. We found a solution to your ... situation. She couldn't even say the word pregnancy. In her world, unmarried pregnancy was a stain that required immediate bleaching. David Chun has agreed to marry you, my father announced, sliding a small velvet box across the table. The engagement ring inside caught the light, a modest diamond that felt more like a business transaction than a symbol of love. His family understands the circumstances and is willing to move forward quickly. I stared at the ring, my hand unconsciously moving to my rounded belly. At 7 months, hiding the pregnancy had become impossible, but facing it head-on felt equally terrifying. I'm not marrying someone I don't love, I said quietly. My mother's laugh was sharp, bitter. Love, Annabel, you're 28 years old, unemployed, and pregnant by a man who disappeared the moment he learned about the baby. This isn't about love. This is about salvaging what's left of your future. And our family's reputation, my father added, his tone suggesting this was the more important factor. I thought about James, his warm brown eyes, the way he'd whispered promises about our future together, how he'd vanished the day after I told him I was carrying his child. The pain of his abandonment still felt fresh, but it didn't make me desperate enough to accept a loveless marriage. I said no. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents exchanged a look, one of those married couple communications that happens without words. Then you have 3 days, my father said finally. 3 days to reconsider, or you'll need to find somewhere else to live. I felt my baby kick, as if responding to the tension in the room. You're kicking me out? We're giving you time to make the right choice, my mother corrected, but her eyes were cold. This family has a reputation to protect, Annabel. Your brother understands that. It's time you did too. Marcus Jr., the golden child, the successful lawyer, the son who'd never disappointed them. The comparison stung, but it wasn't new. I stood up slowly, my hand supporting my lower back. I won't marry David Chun. I won't marry anyone I don't love just to make you comfortable. As I walked toward the stairs to my childhood bedroom, my mother's voice followed me. Then don't come crying to us when you realize what a mistake you've made. I spent the next 3 days in my room, staring at that engagement ring I'd left on the table, waiting for them to change their minds. Waiting for some sign that their love for me, their love for their grandchild, was stronger than their fear of judgment. They never came. Growing up in the Marcus household meant living in the shadow of perfection, or at least the illusion of it. My brother Marcus Jr. was 3 years older and everything my parents had hoped for in a child. Straight A's that led to Harvard Law, a prestigious job at a downtown firm, a beautiful fiancé from the right family. He was the son who would carry on the Marcus name with pride. Then there was me. I found the family photo yesterday while packing, the one from Marcus Jr.'s law school graduation. There we all stood on the Harvard campus, my parents beaming with pride, my brother in his cap and gown, his fiancée Catherine smiling beside him. And there I was, or rather, there I wasn't. Someone had carefully cut me out of the photo, leaving just a sliver of my blue dress visible at the edge. I remembered that day clearly. I'd been 25, working at a small graphic design firm, struggling to pay off my student loans from art school a degree. My parents had reluctantly agreed to fund after I'd proven utterly hopeless at business courses. I'd saved for months to afford the trip to Boston, bought a new dress, and genuinely felt proud of my brother's achievement. But during the family dinner afterward, I'd made the mistake of mentioning my work on a campaign for a local nonprofit supporting single mothers. My mother had grimaced as if I'd announced I was joining the circus. "Really, Annabel?" she'd said, cutting into her salmon with precise movements. "When will you focus on something more substantial?" "I like helping people," I'd replied, too naive at 25 to understand that in my family, helping the wrong people was worse than helping no one at all. My father had cleared his throat. His signal for changing uncomfortable subjects. "Marcus, tell us about the Henderson case." And just like that, I'd become invisible again. This pattern had started early. Marcus Jr.'s finger paintings went on the refrigerator. Mine went in the recycling bin after a polite, "That's nice, dear." Hiss. Soccer games drew both parents to the sidelines. My art shows got a hurried appearance from Mom. Usually with her checking her watch. By high school, I'd stopped trying to compete. While Marcus Jr. was captain of the debate team and student body president, I found refuge in the art room, spending hours lost in watercolors and charcoal sketches. My art teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was the first adult who ever told me I had real talent. "You see things differently, Annabel," she'd said, looking at a portrait I'd drawn of an elderly man feeding pigeons in the park. "That's a gift." But gifts, I learned, only mattered if they translated into respectability and financial success. Art school was acceptable only because it might lead to graphic design, which might lead to advertising, which might lead to corporate success. When I chose to work with small nonprofits instead of pursuing the corporate track, I'd sealed my fate as the family disappointment. The final proof of my failure came when I turned 26 and was still unmarried. Catherine had joined our family, by then beautiful, accomplished Catherine with her MBA and her perfect social connections. She and Marcus Jr. had been together since college, and their engagement had been celebrated like a merger between two successful companies. "When are you going to bring someone home?" my mother would ask during holiday dinners, her tone suggesting this was my most pressing responsibility. I dated, of course. There had been Kevin from college, a sweet poetry major who my parents dismissed as impractical. Then Alex, a teacher who my father called a dead-end career choice. Each relationship had withered under the weight of family disapproval until I'd stopped bringing anyone home at all. That's why James had been such a secret. Meeting him at 27, falling for his easy laugh and his passion for environmental law, I kept him hidden like a treasure I wasn't ready to share. For 4 months, he'd been mine alone, no family judgment. No comparisons to Marcus Jr.'s choices, no lectures about settling down with someone appropriate. Those 4 months were the happiest I'd ever been. James would pick me up after work, and we'd drive to little restaurants outside the city where no one knew the Marcus name. We'd talk for hours about everything except family expectations and social standings. He loved my art, encouraged me to pursue gallery showings, made me feel like maybe being different wasn't the same as being defective. But even James hadn't been strong enough to withstand the reality of who I was, a 28-year-old disappointment from a family that measured worth in dollar signs and social connections. When I told him about the pregnancy, I'd seen the fear in his eyes. Not fear of fatherhood, but fear of being tied to someone like me, someone whose family would never approve, someone who could never give him the kind of life he probably always imagined. He mumbled something about needing time to think, kissed my forehead, and walked out of my apartment. That was 3 months ago. Now, sitting in my childhood bedroom surrounded by packed boxes, I understood that my parents' ultimatum wasn't really about the pregnancy or even about David Chun. It was about finally cutting loose the daughter who'd never fit their mold, who'd never brought them pride, who'd now brought them shame. The pregnancy was just their excuse to do what they'd probably wanted to do. For years erased me from the family photo completely. I kept James's letters in a shoebox under my bed 17. Handwritten notes on cream-colored paper that smelled faintly of his cologne. I'd found them again while packing, and reading them now felt like pressing on a bruise. Annabel. The first one read, "Thank you for lunch today. I haven't laughed that hard in months. Your story about the client who wanted their nonprofit logo to look more profitable had me smiling through my entire afternoon meeting. I hope we can do this again soon." James had met at Cornerstone, coffee on 5th Street. I'd been working on a logo design for a local animal shelter, my laptop balanced precariously on a tiny table, when a man in a charcoal gray suit had approached. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" He gestured to the empty chair across from me. The coffee shop was nearly empty, but something in his voice warm, genuine made me look up from my screen. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and his dark hair was slightly mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it. "All yours," I'd said, then immediately regretted it when he sat down and I realized I'd have to work while being distracted by how he drummed his fingers thoughtfully against his coffee cup while reading legal documents. 20 minutes later, he glanced over at my screen. "Is that a golden retriever wearing a bow tie?" I'd felt my cheeks warm. "It's for an animal shelter." They wanted something distinguished but approachable. "It's perfect," he'd said, and something in his tone made me believe he meant it. "I'm James, by the way. James Sullivan, Annabel Marcus." He'd extended his hand across the small table. "Nice to meet you, Annabel Marcus. Mind if I ask what made you choose graphic design?" Most people ask that question with a slightly condescending tone, as if creative work wasn't quite real work. But James had seemed genuinely curious. "I like helping people tell their stories," I'd said, "especially organizations that are doing good work but don't have big budgets for marketing." That had led to a 3-hour conversation about environmental law, nonprofit work, and the intersection of art and activism. When the coffee shop started closing around us, neither of us had wanted to leave. Annabel read the second letter. "I keep thinking about what you said yesterday about art being a form of service. I never thought about creativity that way, but it makes perfect sense. You're helping organizations communicate their mission to people who might otherwise never hear about them. That seems pretty essential to me. Would you like to have dinner Friday?" I promised not to monopolize the entire evening talking about water rights legislation. James, those first few weeks had been magical in a way I'd never experienced. James would text me articles about environmental design, ask my opinion on color psychology, bring me coffee when I was working late. He treated my work like it mattered, my opinions like they were valuable. More importantly, he treated me like I was valuable. "Annabel." The 5th letter began, "I've been thinking about what you said about your family not understanding your career choice. I know we haven't known each other long, but I want you to know that what you do matters. The animal shelter you designed the logo for? I drove by there yesterday and saw your design on their new sign. There was a family inside looking at adoptable dogs. Your work helped bring them there. That's not small, that's everything. James, for 4 months, we'd existed in our own bubble. James worked long hours at an environmental law firm downtown, fighting corporate polluters and advocating for clean water access. I worked with small nonprofits and community organizations, designing materials that helped them reach the people they served. We understood each other's commitment to work that mattered more than money. He'd never asked about my family's business or their social standing. When I'd mentioned that my brother was a lawyer, James had been more interested in what kind of law Marcus Jr. practiced than what firm he worked for or how much money he made. Corporate mergers and acquisitions, I'd told him. James had wrinkled his nose. Ah, the dark side. I'd laughed, feeling disloyal and delighted at the same time. Annabel, the 10th letter read, I love watching you work. You get this little line between your eyebrows when you're concentrating, and you bite your lower lip when you're trying to solve a design problem. You're so focused, so passionate about getting it right. I find myself staying late at the office, just so I can walk you home and listen to you talk about your projects. Is it weird that I'm falling for someone's work ethic? James I'd kept our relationship secret from my family, telling myself it was because it was too new, too fragile to survive their scrutiny. But really, I'd been protecting something precious, a relationship where I was valued for who I was, not judged for who I wasn't. The 13th letter was the one that had made me cry when I first read it. Annabel, I know I'm not good with words, the way you are with images, but I need you to know something. You make me want to be better, not different better. You see the world in a way that makes me notice things I never paid attention to before. The way morning light hits the windows in your apartment. The satisfaction in your voice when you solve a difficult design challenge. The way you remember the names of all the baristas at every coffee shop we visit. I'm falling in love with you, and I'm falling in love with the person I am when I'm with you. James had been together 6 months when I'd missed my period. I'd waited 2 weeks to take the test, then another week to take 3 more tests, then another week to make a doctor's appointment. By the time I'd worked up the courage to tell James, I was almost 3 months pregnant. I'd planned it carefully, his favorite restaurant, a quiet corner table after we'd finished eating. I'd practiced the words in my mirror at home. James, I have something important to tell you. But when the moment came, I'd lost my nerve. We'd talked about children before in abstract terms. He'd mentioned wanting kids someday, but someday felt very different from now, from accidentally, from with someone whose family would never accept him. I'm pregnant, I'd said finally, the words tumbling out without preamble. The color had drained from his face. Not anger, not disgust, just pure, overwhelming fear. How far along? He'd asked quietly, almost 3 months. He'd been silent for so long that I'd started to fill the space with nervous chatter about options and plans, and how we could figure this out together. But I'd seen the truth in his eyes before he'd even spoken. I need some time to think, he'd said. The last letter in the shoebox was different, shorter, written on different paper. Annabel, I'm sorry. I'm not ready for this. I know that makes me a coward, but I can't pretend I'm someone I'm not. You deserve someone who can be the partner you need, the father this baby needs. I'm not that person. Please don't try to contact me. James had left it on my kitchen counter with his key to my apartment. No conversation, no chance for me to argue or plead or explain. Just 17 letters full of love and one final note full of abandonment. That was 3 months ago. Now, holding these letters in my childhood bedroom, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. Had James ever really loved me, or had I just been a pleasant distraction until real life intruded? The medical records in my purse told a story of stress and shame that I tried to hide from everyone, including myself. High blood pressure at 20 weeks. Severe morning sickness that lasted well into the 2nd trimester. Weight loss when I should have been gaining. Dr. Patterson had been concerned enough to recommend counseling. Pregnancy shouldn't be this physically taxing for someone your age, she'd said during my 24-week appointment. Are you under unusual stress at home or work? I'd lied, of course. Told her I was fine, just excited about becoming a mother. But my body knew the truth, even when my mind refused to acknowledge it. I was slowly being crushed by the weight of keeping this pregnancy secret. For the first 3 months, hiding it had been easy. Loose clothing, strategic angles, avoiding family dinners when possible. I told my small circle of freelance clients that I was dealing with a stomach bug when the morning sickness made it impossible to concentrate on design work. But by month 4, the changes became harder to disguise. My face had rounded slightly, my breasts were noticeably larger, and I developed that unmistakable pregnancy glow that people love to comment on. You look different, my mother had said during a rare visit to my apartment. She'd been dropping off some mail that had been delivered to the family house. Not so subtle reminder that I was still financially dependent on them in small ways. Different how? I'd asked, unconsciously adjusting my oversized sweater. Healthier, I suppose. Maybe you're finally getting enough sleep. I'd nodded and changed the subject, but I'd seen her studying my profile as I'd made us tea. Margaret Marcus had given birth to 2 children. She knew what pregnancy looked like. The truth came out during Sunday dinner in my 5th month. I'd been avoiding these family gatherings, claiming work deadlines and headaches. But my mother had insisted this particular Sunday was important. Catherine's birthday celebration. Marcus Jr. and Catherine had announced their engagement 6 months earlier, and every family gathering since had become a wedding planning session. Venue options, catering menus, guest list conversations that made me feel more invisible than usual. We're thinking spring for the wedding, Catherine had said, her diamond engagement ring catching the light as she gestured. Maybe April or May. Spring is lovely, my mother had agreed. Very romantic, Annabel, you should take notes. Though I suppose you'd need a boyfriend first. The comment had stung, but not as much as it might have 6 months earlier. I'd had a boyfriend. I'd had love letters and shared dreams, and someone who thought my work mattered. The fact that it had ended badly didn't erase the fact that it had existed. I'm fine on my own, I'd said, focusing on my plate of roast chicken. Nonsense. Everyone needs companionship. Look at how happy Marcus and Catherine are together. As if on cue, Marcus Jr. had reached over to squeeze Catherine's hand. They did look happy, perfectly matched in their professional success and social ambitions. Catherine worked in marketing for a luxury hotel chain, the kind of corporate job that made sense to my parents. She wore tailored clothing and expensive jewelry, spoke fluent French, and had opinions about wine that impressed my father. Catherine was just telling me about their honeymoon plans. My mother had continued. 2 weeks in Tuscany. Doesn't that sound wonderful, Annabel? I'd agreed, trying to cut my chicken with hands that had started shaking slightly. The smell of the gravy was making me nauseous, and the tight waistband of my dress was cutting into my expanding middle. Are you feeling all right? Catherine had asked, her voice carrying genuine concern. You look a little pale. I'd stood up too quickly, intending to excuse myself to the bathroom, but the sudden movement had made me dizzy. I grabbed the edge of the table to steady myself, and my loose cardigan had shifted, revealing the obvious curve of my belly beneath my dress. The silence that had followed was deafening. My mother's fork had clattered against her plate. My father had stopped chewing mid-bite. Marcus Jr. and Catherine had exchanged a look of pure shock. Annabel, my mother had said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, are you pregnant? I could have lied. Could have claimed it was weight gain or bloating or a medical condition. But something in me had snapped, maybe exhaustion, maybe relief at finally being found out. Maybe just the simple human need to stop carrying this secret alone. Yes, I'd said. The word had hung in the air like an accusation. How far along? My father had asked, his voice cold. 5 months. 5 months, my mother had repeated, as if trying to process this information. 5 months, and you said nothing? I was scared, I'd admitted. Scared of what? Of telling your family that you're having a baby? But we all knew what I'd been. Scared of? I'd been scared of exactly this, the judgment, the disappointment, the way they were all looking at me like I'd committed some unforgivable sin. Who's the father? Marcus Jr. had asked. Someone I was seeing. It's over now. Over? My mother's voice had been sharp. What do you mean over? He left when I told him about the baby. The look my parents had exchanged then was one I'd never seen before, not just disappointment, but something approaching disgust. So you're having a baby with someone who abandoned you? My father had said. It wasn't a question. I'm having a baby, I'd corrected. The father's involvement is irrelevant. But even as I'd said it, I'd known how it sounded to them. Their unmarried daughter, pregnant by a man who'd disappeared, planning to raise a child alone. Everything they'd spent their lives avoiding: scandal, gossip, social embarrassment. People will talk, my mother had said finally. Let them talk. You don't understand, Annabel. This affects all of us. The family name, your brother's career, the business. The baby isn't responsible for any of that, but you are, my father had said. You made choices, and now we all have to live with the consequences. I'd left that dinner knowing something had fundamentally changed between us. The secret was out, but instead of relief, I'd felt more alone than ever. My family knew about their grandchild, their niece or nephew, and their primary concern was how it would look to other people. That night, I'd called Dr. Patterson's after-hours line. I need to discuss my stress levels, I told the on-call nurse. I think they might be affecting my pregnancy. It was the first completely honest thing I'd said about my situation in months. The business contract was hidden beneath my parents' mattress, but I wouldn't discover it until much later. At the time, I only knew that 2 weeks after my pregnancy announcement, my mother called with unusual excitement in her voice. Annabel, wonderful news. I've spoken with Helen Chun, and she has a proposal that could solve everyone's problems. I've been sketching logo concepts for a youth mentorship program, trying to focus on work instead of the cold silence that had settled over my family since the dinner revelation. My parents hadn't called once in those 2 weeks, no check-ins about my health, no questions about doctor's appointments, no acknowledgement that they were about to become grandparents. What kind of proposal? I'd asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. Her son David is willing to marry you. The words had hit me like ice water. Excuse me? Helen and I have known each other for years through the country club. David is 32, very successful in real estate development. He's been focused on his career, hasn't had time for serious relationships, but he's ready to settle down. Now, I'd set down my pencil, my hand trembling slightly. Mom, I don't even know David Chen. You met him at the Hartwell charity auction last year. Tall, very polite, drives that nice BMW. I'd had a vague memory of a conversation with a well-dressed man at a fundraising event, something about property values and market trends that had put me to sleep standing up. Pleasant enough, but we'd had absolutely nothing in common. I barely remember him. That's not important right now. What's important is that he's willing to give your baby his name and provide financial security. You'd never have to worry about money again. The clinical way she discussed it had made my skin crawl. I'm not marrying someone I don't love. Love is a luxury you can't afford right now, my mother had said. You're about to be a single mother with no reliable income. What happens when the baby gets sick? When you can't work because you're up all night? When you need childcare so you can take freelance projects? Each question had felt like a small knife cutting away at my confidence. I'd been asking myself the same things, lying awake at night, calculating costs, and wondering how I'd manage everything alone. David understands the situation, she'd continued. He knows this isn't a love match. But he wants children and you need security. It's practical. What does he get out of it? There had been a pause too long to calculated. A wife an instant. Family. Not everyone has time for traditional courtship, Annabel. But I'd sensed there was more to it. Something she wasn't telling me. 3 days later, David Chen had taken me to dinner at Meridian, an upscale restaurant downtown where the waiters wore white gloves and the wine list was longer than most novels. He'd arrived exactly on time, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit and an expensive watch that caught the light when he'd reached across the table. "Your mother tells me you're expecting," he'd said after we'd ordered, as casually as if he were commenting on the weather. "Yes, due in February." "And the father isn't in the picture?" It hadn't been a question, but I'd nodded anyway. "I see. That must be difficult." David had the social skills of someone who had spent his career in business development smooth, practiced, able to navigate uncomfortable conversations without showing discomfort. That there was something detached about the way he'd spoken, as if we were negotiating a contract rather than discussing a potential marriage. "Helen, your mother, has explained my situation as well," he continued. "I'm at a point in my life where marriage makes sense professionally and personally. I travel frequently for business, so I need someone who can maintain our home and social obligations. A wife who understands that my career requires significant time and attention. What about children?" I'd asked. "You'd be taking on someone else's baby?" "I want children," he'd said. "This arrangement gives me that opportunity immediately, plus the possibility of additional children in the future if we're both amenable." He'd spoken about having children the way he might discuss expanding at business practical considerations and future growth opportunities. And if we're not happy together? David had taken a sip of his wine before answering. Happiness is often overrated. Mutual respect, shared goals, compatible lifestyles, those tend to create more stable marriages than passion. I thought about James, about the way my heart had raced when he'd smiled at me, about the letters that had made me feel like I was the center of someone's universe. That had been passion, and look how it had ended. "What would you expect from me?" I'd asked. "Discretion? Social presence when required for business functions? Management of household affairs? Eventually, additional children, if possible? And what would I get? Financial security? Health insurance for you and the baby? A comfortable home? Social standing? Your child would have a father's name and every advantage I can provide." He'd reached into his jacket then and pulled out a small velvet box, the same one that would later sit on my parents' dining table like an accusation. "I know this isn't conventional, Annabel, but conventional hasn't worked well for either of us, has it?" The ring inside had been beautiful, a classic solitaire that looked expensive and appropriate. The kind of ring that would photograph well at society events, that would signal to everyone that I'd made a respectable choice despite my circumstances. "I need time to think about it," I'd said. "Of course. But I should mention that this offer has a time limit. I'll be traveling to Asia for the next month on business. If you're interested in moving forward, we'd need to finalize arrangements before I leave. How much time do I have?" 2 weeks. Driving home that night, I felt like I was drowning. David Chun was offering me everything I needed: security, respectability, a father for my baby. He was successful, stable, and willing to accept a situation that most men would run from. But he'd also made it clear that this would be a business arrangement with emotional benefits, not a marriage built on love or even genuine affection. I'd be trading my independence and any chance of real love for financial security and social approval. The next morning, my mother had called again. "Well, how did dinner go?" he proposed. "Sort of. That's wonderful. Did you set a date?" "Mom, I haven't said yes yet. What's to think about?" "David is perfect for you, Annabel. He's successful, stable, and willing to take on your situation. You'll never get another offer like this." Her words had stung because part of me feared they were true. What man would want to marry a pregnant woman whose baby's father had abandoned them? Who would choose to take on that kind of complexity and responsibility? I just need some time. Time for what? To find someone better? To wait for the baby's real father to come back? That's not going to happen, Annabel. This is real life, not some romantic movie. But even as she'd said it, I'd known that something about the arrangement felt wrong. Not just the lack of love, but something deeper. Something she still wasn't telling me about why David Chun was really willing to marry a woman he barely knew. The fake eviction notice was convincing official letterhead, legal language, a 30-day deadline that would expire just before David's trip to Asia. I found it slipped under my apartment door on a Tuesday morning, and for a terrifying moment, I believed it was real. Mrs. Marcus, it read, "This notice serves to inform you that your lease agreement will be terminated due to non-payment of utilities. You have 30 days to vacate the premises or face legal action." My hands had shaken as I'd read it because I knew I'd been struggling to keep up with bills since cutting back on client work due to pregnancy exhaustion. But when I'd called the property management company, the receptionist had seemed confused. "I'm sorry, Ms. Marcus, but I don't show any outstanding balances on your account." "Are you sure you received this notice from our office?" That's when I looked more closely at the letterhead. The logo was slightly wrong, the address had a missing digit, and the signature belonged to someone who didn't work for the property management company. Someone had gone to significant trouble to create a convincing fake. I'd called my mother immediately. "Mom, did you have anything to do with an eviction notice being delivered to my apartment?" "What eviction notice?" She'd asked, but there had been something too careful about her tone. "Someone slipped a fake legal notice under my door. It's designed to scare me into thinking I'm about to be homeless." The pause had been long enough to confirm my suspicions. "Annabel, maybe this is a sign that you need to reconsider David's proposal. You're 7 months pregnant, struggling financially. You had this fake notice made. I'm trying to help you see reality. You can't keep living in fantasy land, pretending you can handle this situation alone." The betrayal had hit me harder than I'd expected. "You're trying to manipulate me into marrying someone I don't love. I'm trying to save you from a disaster of your own making." I'd hung up and spent the next hour pacing my small apartment, feeling the baby kick restlessly. As my stress levels spiked, everything felt like it was closing in my family's pressure. My dwindling savings, the approaching deadline of David's business trip, and now the realization that my own mother was willing to lie and manipulate me to get what she wanted. Evening, David had called. "Annabel, I hope you don't mind, but your mother mentioned you're having some housing issues." "My housing is fine, of course. But I wanted to reiterate that my offer includes immediate housing. The guest bedroom in my condo could be converted to a nursery, and you'd never have to worry about rent or utilities again." I'd understood then that the fake eviction notice had been coordinated, a two-pronged attack designed to highlight my vulnerabilities while positioning David as my savior. "David, can I ask you something honestly?" "Certainly." "Why do you really want to marry me? We barely know each other. I'm carrying another man's child, and there are certainly other women who would be interested in you without all this complication." There had been another pause, the kind I'd learned to recognize when someone was choosing their words carefully. "I'm 32 years old, Annabel. I've spent the last decade building my business, and now I'm ready for the next phase of my life. Marriage, children, the social stability that comes with being settled. You need security and legitimacy. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. But why me specifically? Your family has good social standing. You're educated, presentable, and you won't interfere with my business travels since you'll have the baby to focus on. Most importantly, you understand this is practical rather than romantic, which eliminates a lot of potential drama." His honesty had been refreshing and horrifying at the same time. I was being selected like a business partner, evaluated for my usefulness rather than my desirability. What if I say no? Then you say no. But I'll be leaving for Asia next week, and when I return in a month, this offer won't be available anymore. I don't have unlimited time to wait for someone who's not. Sure, they want what I'm offering. After he'd hung up, I'd sat in my apartment feeling the baby moving inside me and trying to imagine our future. Could I really raise a child alone? My freelance income was unpredictable at best. I had no family support, no partner, no safety, net beyond my own determination. But every time I tried to envision myself walking down the aisle toward David Chen, I felt something inside me rebel, not just because I didn't love him, but because the whole arrangement felt like giving up on the possibility that my life could be different, better, more authentic than what my family expected. I'd thought about James's letters about the 4 months when I'd felt truly valued and understood. That relationship had ended badly, but it had shown me what it felt like to be with someone who saw me as more than a problem to be solved or a role to be filled. The next morning, I called my parents and asked to meet them for lunch. We'd sat in the same restaurant where David had proposed his arrangement, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. "I've made my decision about David," I'd announced after we'd ordered. "Wonderful," my mother had said, already smiling. "I'm saying no." The smile had disappeared instantly. "Annabel, you can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. I won't marry someone I don't love just to make you comfortable with my situation." "This isn't about our comfort," my father had said. "This is about your future and your child's future. My child deserves a mother who models integrity and authenticity, not someone who settles for convenience. Your child deserves a father and financial security," my mother had countered. "Maybe, but not at the expense of everything else." We'd sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of my decision settling over all of us. Finally, my father had cleared his throat. "Then you have 3 days. 3 days for what? To change your mind or find somewhere else to live?" Even though I'd expected it, hearing the ultimatum out loud had felt like a physical blow. "You're really going to kick out your pregnant daughter because she won't enter into an arranged marriage? We're giving you time to reconsider a decision that will affect the rest of your life," my mother had said. "This family has worked too hard to build its reputation to watch you destroy it with poor choices." I'd stood up slowly, my hand automatically moving to support my lower back where the baby's weight had been causing persistent aches. "Then I guess I have packing to do." As I'd walked away from the table, I'd heard my mother say to my father, "She'll change her mind. She has to." But I'd known even then that I wouldn't. The house keys felt heavier than they should have as I placed them on the kitchen counter where I'd eaten breakfast for 28 years. Next to them, I laid the family credit cards, the ones I'd used for emergencies, for gas when money was tight, for the illusion that I still belong somewhere. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus Jr. had asked, appearing in the doorway with an expression I'd never seen before, something between concern and disapproval. I hadn't expected him to be there. My parents had made the 3-day ultimatum, but my brother had stayed conspicuously silent during family discussions about my situation. Now, watching me pack the last of my belongings into 2 suitcases and a box, he looked uncomfortable. "I'm sure," I'd said, though my voice wavered slightly. "David Chen is a good guy, Annabel. He's offering you something most women in your position would be grateful for." "Most women in my position?" I'd repeated. "You mean pregnant and abandoned?" Marcus Jr. had winced. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" He'd been quiet for a moment, studying his hands. My brother had always been careful with words, a skill that served him well as a lawyer, but made him frustrating as a family member when I needed honesty more than diplomacy. "I mean, unmarried and pregnant with limited financial resources," he'd said finally. Marriage to David would solve a lot of problems. It would solve your problems and mom and dad's problems. I'm not sure it would solve mine. Having a baby alone is going to be incredibly difficult. I'd looked at him, then really looked, and realized that my successful, accomplished older brother was genuinely worried about me. Not about the family, reputation, or social embarrassment, but about my ability to survive what was coming next. I know it will be difficult, I'd admitted, but marrying someone I don't love, would it make it easier? It would just make it different. Marcus Jr. had picked up one of my suitcases, testing its weight. Where will you go? I found a small apartment across town. Month-to-month lease, nothing fancy, but it's mine. Can you afford it? The question I'd been avoiding asking myself. I'll figure it out. He'd set the suitcase down and pulled out his wallet, extracting several $100 bills. Take this, Marcus, I can't. Yes, you can. Consider it a loan if it makes you feel better, but take it. You're going to need it. I'd stared at the money, feeling tears burn behind my eyes. It was the first genuine gesture of support I'd received from my family since announcing the pregnancy. Thank you, I'd whispered. I don't agree with what you're doing, he'd said quietly, but I don't agree with what they're doing either. Before I could respond, our mother's voice had echoed from the front hallway. Annabel, are you ready? Ready, as if I was heading off to college or starting a new job, rather than being expelled from the family for refusing to marry a stranger. Coming, I'd called back. Margaret Marcus had stood in the foyer wearing her perfectly pressed slacks and silk blouse, her expression carefully composed. She'd always been beautiful in a sharp, controlled way, but that morning she'd looked brittle, like she might crack if anyone spoke too loudly. Your father is waiting in the car, she'd said. He'll drive you to your new place. The formality of it had struck me as absurd. My father was going to help me move out the same way he might have helped me move into a college dorm practical assistance rendered without emotional investment. Mom, I'd said as Marcus Jr. carried my suitcases toward the car, is this really what you want? Your daughter and grandchild out of your life because I won't marry someone I don't love? For just a moment, her composed expression had slipped. I'd seen something that might have been regret or sadness or fear, but then the mask had snapped back into place. I want you to make smart decisions, she'd said. This isn't a smart decision. Maybe not, I'd agreed. But it's my decision to make. The drive to my new apartment had been silent except for the GPS directions and my father's occasional sighs. Marcus Sr. had always been a man of few words, but his disappointment had filled the car like smoke. When we'd pulled up to the small complex on Maple Street, he looked at the modest building with barely concealed dismay. This is it? He'd asked. This is it. My new home was a studio apartment on the second floor of a converted house. One room that served as bedroom, living room, and office, with a kitchenette that could charitably be called cozy and a bathroom barely large enough for one person, let alone one person plus a baby, but it was mine. The lease was in my name, paid for with my own money and my brother's emergency loan. No conditions, no expectations, no arranged marriages required. My father had carried my suitcases up the narrow stairs without comment, setting them down in the middle of the empty room. The space looked even smaller with him standing in it, this tall, imposing man who'd built a business empire, now reduced to helping his daughter move into a place that probably cost less per month than his weekly golf membership. The babies. Due in February, I'd said, more to fill the silence than because he'd asked. Yes, your mother mentioned that. I'll need to set up a crib over there. I gestured toward the corner by the window. There's good natural light. He'd nodded without enthusiasm. Dad, I'd said finally, I know you think I'm making a mistake. I think you're making several mistakes, he'd corrected, but they're yours to make. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't complete condemnation either. Coming from Marcus Sr., it was almost supportive. After he'd left, I'd sat on the hardwood floor of my empty apartment and cried. Not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming weight of what I'd just done. I'd chosen uncertainty over security, independence over approval, authenticity over acceptance. The baby had kicked then, a strong movement that felt almost like encouragement. I'd placed my hand on my belly and spoken out loud for the first time since James had left. "It's just you and me now," I'd said, "but we're going to be okay." I'd spent the rest of the day unpacking my small collection of belongings and trying to envision how this tiny space would work with a baby. Where would I put the changing table? How would I work on design projects while caring for an infant? Could I afford childcare so I could take on more clients? Every question had led to 3 more questions, but for the first time in months. They'd felt like my questions to answer rather than problems for someone else to solve. That evening, I'd called Dr. Patterson's office and scheduled an appointment. "I've had some significant life changes," I told the receptionist. "I'd like to discuss how to manage stress during the remainder of my pregnancy." As I'd hung up the phone, I'd realized that for the first time since learning I was pregnant, I'd made a healthcare decision without considering how it would affect anyone else's reputation or comfort level. It was a small thing, but it felt like the beginning of something larger, the beginning of being responsible only to myself and my baby rather than to everyone else's expectations of who I should be. The lease agreement for apartment 2B became my first real act of independence, my signature alone, my responsibility alone, my sanctuary alone. The document was simple, standard, but holding it felt like holding proof that I could exist outside. My family's sphere of influence. Monthly rent, $800. Security deposit, $800. Tenant agrees to maintain property in good condition and notify landlord of any necessary repairs. $800. Might as well have been $8,000 given my current financial situation, but I'd made it work. Marcus Jr.'s emergency loan, combined with the small amount I'd managed to save from freelance projects, would cover the first 3 months. If I was careful about everything else, the apartment came furnished with the basics: a Murphy bed that folded down from the wall, a small table with 2 chairs, a worn but comfortable armchair by the window. The previous tenant had left behind some kitchen supplies and a coffee maker that looked older than I was, but still worked perfectly. My first morning waking up in my own space, I'd made coffee and sat by the window watching the neighborhood come to life. Maple Street was different from the tree-lined avenue where I'd grown up, more diverse, more alive, full of people heading to jobs that probably didn't require suits and social connections. The woman next door left for work at 7:30. Sharp, wearing scrubs and carrying a large travel mug. The family downstairs had 3 young children who played in the small backyard while their father worked on an old motorcycle in the driveway. Across the street, an elderly man tended a garden that seemed impossible to maintain in such a small space, but somehow thrived anyway. These people lived real lives, working jobs that mattered, raising families on modest incomes, finding joy in small pleasures. For the first time in my life, I felt like I might belong somewhere. My first priority was establishing a routine that would work with pregnancy fatigue and the need to generate income. I'd wake up early, work on design projects while my energy was highest, then spend afternoons walking around the neighborhood or handling practical tasks like grocery shopping and setting up utilities. The grocery shopping had been an education in itself. At home, I'd never paid attention to food costs. We'd shopped at expensive stores, bought name brands, never checked prices. Now, I found myself comparing the cost per ounce of different products, buying generic brands, and discovering that cooking from scratch was both cheaper and healthier than the prepared foods I'd grown up eating. I'd also discovered that being pregnant made me a magnet for unsolicited advice from strangers. "You should be drinking more milk," the cashier at the corner market had informed me. "Walking is good, but don't overdo it. the bus driver had said when I'd climbed aboard slowly. "Have you thought about what you'll do for childcare?" The pharmacist had asked when I'd picked up prenatal vitamins. Everyone had opinions about pregnancy, single motherhood, and what I should be doing differently. But somehow, coming from strangers who had no investment in my family's reputation, the advice felt less judgmental and more genuinely caring. The hardest part was the loneliness. I'd never lived completely alone before college had meant dorm mates and roommates, and then I'd moved back home after graduation. The silence in my small apartment could be overwhelming, especially in the evenings when I'd finish work and had nothing to distract me from thinking about everything I'd lost and everything I still had to figure out. Some nights, I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to call my mother, wanting to share some small detail about my day or ask her opinion about baby names. But then I'd remember the cold disappointment in her voice during our last conversation, and I'd put the phone down. Instead, I'd started talking to the baby. "Your room is going to be right here by the window," I'd say, placing my hand on my growing belly. "You'll get morning light, and I can watch you sleep while I work." I'm thinking about the name Emma if you're a girl, or maybe Daniel if you're a boy. What do you think? Your Uncle Marcus gave us some money to help get started. He doesn't agree with what I'm doing, but he's trying to help anyway. That's what family should do. The baby seemed to respond to my voice, moving more when I spoke directly to her. I'd started thinking of the baby as her, though I declined to learn the sex during ultrasounds. Somehow, the conversations made the apartment feel less empty and made my situation feel less desperate. I'd also started working on a project that had nothing to do with paying clients, an illustrated journal documenting my pregnancy journey. Each day, I'd write a few sentences about how I was feeling, what I was thinking about, what hopes and fears I had for the future. Then I'd add small sketches, my growing profile, the view from my window, images of how I imagined our life together would look. It wasn't marketable work, and it didn't generate income, but it felt important in a way that my commercial design projects never had. I was creating something that would help me remember this time, not just the fear and uncertainty, but also the courage it had taken to choose independence over security. 3 weeks after moving in, I'd received my first piece of mail addressed to Annabel Marcus at my new address. It was just a utility bill, but seeing my name connected to this place had felt like an official confirmation that I belonged here. That same day, I'd gotten a call from a potential new client, a nonprofit that worked with teen mothers referred to me by someone who'd seen my work with other community organizations. As I discussed their need for educational materials and website graphics, I'd realized that my own experience might actually make me better at this kind of work. I understood now what it felt like to be judged for your choices, to have people assume they knew your story based on your circumstances, to need support more than judgment. That understanding would make me a better advocate for organizations serving people who'd been dismissed by more traditional institutions. For the first time since learning I was pregnant, I'd felt like my situation might be an asset rather than just a liability. Maybe being different from what my family expected wasn't a failure. Maybe it was preparation for a different kind of success. The business card was cream-colored with elegant black lettering. Sarah Kim, attorney at law, family and immigration services. Pro bono consultations available. Mrs. Patterson had pressed it into my hand, along with a plate of homemade cookies, and the kind of unsolicited wisdom that comes from 7 decades of living. My neighbor is 8 months pregnant and just moved in alone. She told Sarah Kim during what I later learned was their weekly coffee meeting. Something tells me she might need a friend who understands the law. Eleanor Patterson lived in apartment 2A, just across the narrow hallway from my door. She was 73 years old, had buried 2 husbands, raised 4 children, and possessed the rare gift of being genuinely interested in other people's lives without being judgmental about their choices. I'd met her my second day in the building. when she'd appeared at my door with a casserole dish and a warm smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood, dear. I'm Eleanor, but everyone calls me Mrs. P. I brought dinner, figured you might not have had time to get groceries yet." The casserole had been tuna noodle, simple but perfectly seasoned, and it had lasted me 3 meals. More importantly, it had been the first home-cooked food I'd eaten since leaving my parents' house, and the gesture had nearly brought me to tears. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" Mrs. P had asked, noticing my emotional response to her kindness. "Just grateful," I'd managed. "Thank you." Over the following weeks, Mrs. P had become my unofficial guide to single living. She'd shown me which grocery stores had the best prices, which bus routes were most reliable, and how to negotiate with the building's temperamental washing machine in the basement. More importantly, she'd shown me that it was possible to live alone without being lonely. I've been on my own for 8 years now. She told me one afternoon as we'd sat on the building's small front porch. After Harold died, he was my second husband. I thought I'd move in with one of my kids. But you know what? I like my independence. I like deciding when to eat dinner, what to watch on television, whether to stay up late reading or go to bed early. Don't you get lonely? Sometimes. But lonely and alone are different things. I'm alone by choice most of the time, but I'm not lonely because I have people I care about who care about me back. She gestured toward the street, where the neighbor with the motorcycle was teaching his youngest daughter to ride a bicycle. Community isn't just family, dear. Sometimes the people who aren't related to you are the ones who understand you best. That's how I'd met Sarah Kim through Mrs. P's extensive network of people she'd collected over the years like treasures. Sarah was 35, a successful immigration attorney who volunteered her time helping women navigate legal challenges. She was also 7 months pregnant with her second child, married to a pediatrician, and living proof that it was possible to balance career, family, and service to others. "Mrs. P tells me you're going through some family difficulties," Sarah had said during our first meeting at a coffee shop near her downtown office. I'd given her the abbreviated version: family disapproval, pressure to marry, choosing independence over their expectations, and the baby's father. Completely out of the picture, left when I told him about the pregnancy. Sarah had nodded without judgment. "Are you concerned about custody issues?" "Should I be?" "Probably not, if he's shown no interest in being involved, but it's good to be prepared." "Have you thought about what you'll do if your family tries to interfere with your parenting decisions?" The question had caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "Sometimes families who disagree with a woman's choices during pregnancy continue to disagree with her choices after the baby is born. Grandparents' rights vary by state, but there are situations where family members can petition for visitation or even custody." A chill had run down my spine. They wouldn't do that. I hope not. But it's worth understanding your rights just in case. Sarah had spent the next hour explaining legal protections for single mothers, the importance of establishing paternity or the lack thereof, and resources available for women raising children without family support. "The most important thing is documentation," she'd said. "Keep records of your prenatal care, your living situation, your income sources. If anyone ever questions your fitness as a mother, you want to be able to prove that you've been responsible and prepared." She'd also connected me with a support group for single mothers that met weekly at a community center across town. I'd been hesitant at first, the idea of sitting in a circle talking about personal problems with strangers felt overwhelming. But the first meeting had surprised me. Instead of a therapy session, it had been more like a practical workshop. Women sharing resources about affordable childcare, discussing strategies for managing work and parenting, celebrating small victories like getting promoted or their children reaching developmental milestones. "You're the graphic designer, right?" A woman named Maria had approached me after the meeting. "I heard you do work for nonprofits." Maria was 26, mother of a 3-year-old, and worked as a medical assistant while studying to become a registered nurse. She'd also started a small organization providing educational materials about healthcare access to immigrant families. "We don't have much of a budget," she'd said, "but we desperately need someone to help us design brochures and flyers that don't look like they were made on a copy machine." I'd agreed to help pro bono, partly because I believed in the work and partly because it felt good to be needed for my skills rather than judged for my circumstances. Working with Maria's organization had led to other referrals, small nonprofits and community groups who needed professional design work but couldn't afford agency rates. The pay was modest, but the work was meaningful. And slowly I'd begun to build a client base that aligned with my values rather than just my financial needs. "You're building something?" Mrs. P had observed one evening as I'd worked on a poster for a literacy program while she'd knitted in the chair across from me. "Not just a business, but a life that makes sense for who you are." She'd been right. For the first time since college, I'd felt like I was using my talents in ways that mattered. Working with people who value creativity and service over profit, margins and social connections. The irony wasn't lost on me that in losing my family's support, I'd found a community of people who understood struggle, who celebrated small victories, and who measured success in terms of resilience rather than respectability. 3 weeks after meeting Sarah Kim, she'd called with unexpected news. "I've been thinking about your situation," she'd said, "and I want to make sure you're prepared for any legal challenges that might arise. Can you come in tomorrow? I'd like to discuss some precautionary measures." "What kind of challenges?" "The kind that sometimes happen when families have strong opinions about grandchildren. They feel they have a right to influence." Her tone had been careful, professional, but something in it had made my blood run cold. As if she knew something I didn't, something I needed to be prepared for. The legal documents were thick, official, and terrifying. They arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who looked uncomfortable handing legal papers to a visibly pregnant woman in a bathrobe. "Annabel Marcus?" he'd asked. "Yes." "You've been served." The envelope contained a petition for emergency custody evaluation filed by Margaret and Marcus Sr. According to the legal language, they were requesting immediate intervention due to my unstable living conditions, lack of adequate support systems, and demonstrated pattern of poor decision-making that poses a risk to the welfare of the unborn child. I'd sat on my small couch, reading the document 3 times before the full implications sank in. My parents weren't just disapproving of my choices, they were actively trying to take my baby. The petition painted a picture of me that was technically accurate but deliberately misleading. Yes, I lived in a small apartment. Yes, I was unmarried. And pregnant. Yes, I had limited financial resources. But the way they'd presented these facts made me sound like a danger to my own child, rather than a woman making the best of difficult circumstances. "The respondent has refused reasonable marriage, arrangements that would provide financial stability and social support for the child," one section read. "Instead, she has chosen to live in substandard housing while pursuing irregular employment that cannot adequately support a child's needs." The worst part was the section about my mental health. They'd somehow obtained information about my calls to Dr. Patterson's office regarding stress management and had twisted them into evidence of psychological instability. Medical records indicate the respondent has sought treatment for stress-related complications during pregnancy, suggesting an inability to cope with the responsibilities of motherhood. I called Sarah Kim immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. "They're trying to take my baby," I'd said when she'd answered. "Who is trying to take your baby?" "My parents. They filed some kind of custody petition." "Can they do that?" "Bring the papers to my office immediately," Sarah had said. "Don't talk to anyone else about this until I've reviewed everything." An hour Later, I'd sat in Sarah's downtown office while she'd read through the documents with the focused intensity of someone who'd seen similar cases before. "This is aggressive," she'd said finally, "and expensive. They've hired Kellerman and Associates, one of the most prestigious family law firms in the city. Is that bad?" "It means they're serious and they have significant financial resources to pursue this. But it doesn't mean they'll win." Sarah had explained that grandparents' rights varied significantly by state, and that in our jurisdiction, grandparents could petition for custody only if they could prove that the parents were unfit or that the child's welfare was at immediate risk. "The good news is that you're not actually a parent yet," she'd said. "This petition is premature. They're trying to establish custody before the baby is even born, which is unusual and legally questionable." "What's the bad news?" "The bad news is that they clearly have resources and motivation. This isn't going to be a simple matter of filing a response and moving on." She'd walked me through the timeline. I have 30 days to respond to the petition. During that time, the court might order a home evaluation, interviews with potential witnesses, and a review of my financial and medical records. "What kind of witnesses?" "People who can speak to your character, your fitness as a potential mother, your living situation, the support group you attend, Mrs. Patterson, clients you've worked with, anyone who can provide evidence that you're responsible and capable." The irony was bitter. The same independence that my parents saw as evidence of poor judgment would now have to be presented as proof of my competence. "What about David Chun?" I'd asked. "Will they try to argue that refusing to marry him proves I'm unfit?" Sarah had paused, her expression troubled. "That's actually what concerns me most about this petition. There's language here suggesting that refusing reasonable marriage arrangements constitutes neglect of the child's welfare. That's not legally sound, but it suggests they have a specific narrative they're trying to build." She'd leaned forward, her voice becoming more serious. "Annabel, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Is there anything about David Chun or his family that your parents haven't told you? Any reason they would be so insistent on this particular marriage arrangement?" "I don't know. I got the feeling there was more to it, but they never explained why David was willing to marry someone he barely knew." "We need to find out. Because if this custody petition is really about forcing you into that marriage, then we're dealing with something much more complex than disapproving grandparents." After leaving Sarah's office, I'd walked home in a daze. The familiar streets of my neighborhood looked different somehow, as if I was seeing them through the lens of a court evaluation. Would a judge think my apartment was too small? Would living in a converted house rather than a single-family home count against me? Would my neighbors be seen as character witnesses or evidence that I lived in an inappropriate environment? That evening, Mrs. P had knocked on my door with a cup of tea and the kind of intuitive timing that comes from years of caring about people. "You look like you've had some bad news, dear." I'd shown her the legal documents, watching her face grow increasingly stern as she'd read. "This is ridiculous," she'd said finally. "You're one of the most responsible young women I've ever met, working hard, taking care of yourself, preparing for this baby. What more do they want? They want me to marry David Chen and live the life they've planned for me." Mrs. P had set down the papers and fixed me with a look that reminded me she'd raised 4 children and buried 2 husbands. "Well, they can't have it. You're an adult, this is your baby, and you've made your choices. Now we need to make sure you have the support to defend those choices." Over the next few days, Mrs. P had mobilized her network like a general preparing for battle. She'd called her daughter who worked as a social worker, her former neighbor who was a retired family court judge, and her hairdresser whose sister worked for Child Protective Services. "Knowledge is power," she'd told me. "And we're going to make sure you have all the knowledge you need." The more I'd learned about custody battles, the more I'd understood that this wasn't really about my fitness as a mother. This was about control money, and the lengths my family was willing to go to maintain their vision of respectability. But I'd also learned something else. I wasn't as alone as I thought. Sarah Kim was working on my case pro bono. Mrs. P had appointed herself my unofficial campaign manager, and the women in my support group had rallied around me with offers of help, testimony, and practical support. For the first time since receiving those legal papers, I'd felt something other than fear. I'd felt determined. The private investigator's report arrived in a manila envelope marked confidential and changed everything I thought I knew about my family's motivations. Sarah Kim had hired the investigator after our initial meeting, following a hunch that David Chun's willingness to marry a pregnant stranger was about more than just wanting instant family. "You need to see this," Sarah had said, calling me into her office 3 days after the custody papers had been served. "And you need to sit down." The report was 12 pages long, but the crucial information was summarized in the first paragraph. David Chun is the sole heir to a family trust worth approximately $47 million, with inheritance conditions that require him to be married with at least one child by his 33rd birthday. Subject turns 33 in March. Failure to meet these conditions results in forfeiture of inheritance to charity. I'd stared at the page, reading the words multiple times before they'd sunk in. $47 million. That's just what the investigator could verify through public records and business filings, Sarah had said. The actual amount could be higher. I'd flicked through the rest of the report, which detailed the Chun family's business empire real estate developments, import-export operations, and investment holdings that spanned 3 states. David's grandfather had established the trust, with very specific conditions about family legacy and continuation of the bloodline. So David needs to be married with a child by March, or he loses everything. Exactly. And you're 8 months pregnant, which means your baby would be born well before his deadline. The pieces had started falling into place with sickening clarity. David's willingness to marry someone he barely knew, his specific timeline for the arrangement, his mention of additional children in the future, as if my baby was just the first requirement to be checked off a list. But why would my parents know about this? I'd asked. Sarah had turned to page 6 of the report. Because your father's business is in serious financial trouble. The investigator had uncovered that Marcus Industries was facing bankruptcy, with debts exceeding assets by nearly $3 million. My father had been hiding the company's decline for over 2 years, using personal assets and lines of credit to keep the business afloat. The Chun family approached your parents 6 months ago with a proposal, Sarah had continued. David would marry you, gaining access to his inheritance. In exchange, the Chun family would invest enough money in Marcus Industries to save it from bankruptcy. I'd felt physically sick. They were selling me. Not selling, more like trading. Your marriage to David would solve everyone's financial problems, his inheritance requirements, your father's business debt, and your situation with the pregnancy. The investigator had even found documentation of preliminary business agreements between the 2 families, contingent on the successful completion of David's marriage and inheritance claim. When you refused to marry David, Sarah had said, you didn't just ruin your parents' plan for your respectability. You ruined their plan for financial survival. I thought about the fake eviction notice, the 3-day ultimatum, the legal papers claiming I was an unfit mother. None of it had been about concern for my welfare or my baby's future. It had all been about money. The custody petition isn't really about taking my baby, is it? I don't think so. I think it's about pressuring you into reconsidering the marriage. If they can convince a court that you're an unfit mother, they can argue that the only way to provide for your child's welfare is through marriage to David. Sarah had leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. They're trying to use the legal system to force you into a business transaction. The report had included one more crucial detail. David's trust deadline wasn't just about marriage, it required him to be married to someone who could provide legitimate heirs. The specific language excluded adoption, stepchildren, or any arrangement that didn't result in biological children born within the marriage. So even if I married David, tomorrow my baby wouldn't count toward his inheritance requirements. Not unless he legally adopted the child and you had additional children together within the marriage. The scope of the deception had been staggering. David would have married me, legally adopted my baby to satisfy appearances, then pressured me to have additional children quickly to meet his real inheritance requirements. And my parents would have been complicit in the entire arrangement. Knowing that I was being manipulated into a situation that served everyone's interests except my own, I'd spent the rest of that day walking around the city, trying to process what I'd learned. The family I'd grown up with, people I'd loved, despite their disappointment in me, had been willing to trade my autonomy and my child's welfare for financial gain, but I'd also felt something unexpected, relief. For months, I'd questioned my decision to refuse David's proposal, wondering if I was being naive or selfish for prioritizing love over security. Now I knew that my instincts had been right. The arrangement hadn't been about my welfare or my baby's future. It had been about solving other people's problems at my expense. That evening, I called Mrs. P and asked if she wanted to have dinner. Over her famous tuna casserole, I told her everything the investigator had discovered. Well, she'd said when I'd finished, that explains why they were so pushy about this David fellow. $47 million is a lot of motivation for that behavior. I feel like such an idiot for not seeing it. Honey, you're not supposed to have to investigate your own family's motives. You trusted them to have your best interests at heart, which is what children are supposed to do with their parents. Mrs. P had reached across the table and patted my hand, but now you know the truth, and that gives you power. They can't manipulate you with guilt or fear anymore because you understand what's really driving their behavior. She'd been right. Armed with the truth about the money, the business deals, and the inheritance requirements, I felt less like a victim of circumstances and more like someone who'd made an informed choice to reject a corrupt arrangement. The next morning, I'd called Sarah with a new sense of determination. What do we need to do to fight this custody petition? We document everything, she'd said. Your prenatal care, your living situation, your work history, your support system. And we prepare to expose the real motives behind this legal action. Can we use the investigator's report in court? Absolutely. And if your parents want to argue that you're an unfit mother for refusing a marriage arrangement, we'll make sure the judge understands exactly what kind of arrangement they were trying to force you into. For the first time since receiving those legal papers, I felt like I had a fighting chance. The Marcus Industries shareholder documents told a story of decades of decline, hidden behind a facade of respectability. Sarah's investigator had obtained them through public business filings, and reading through them felt like watching my family's reputation crumble in real time. Marcus Industries had been my grandfather's company, started in 1952 as a small construction firm that grew into a mid-sized commercial development business. My father had inherited it in 1987 with great fanfare and big plans for expansion. For the first decade, those plans had seemed to work. The company had grown, taken on larger projects, and established Marcus Sr. as a respected businessman in the community. But the financial records showed that the success had been largely illusory, built on over-leveraging and risky investments that had gradually eroded the company's foundation. Your father borrowed against future projects to fund current operations, Sarah had explained as we'd reviewed the documents. It's a common pattern in failing businesses, robbing Peter to pay Paul until there's no one left to rob. The timeline was damning. 2008 had been the beginning of the end. when the economic recession had killed several major development projects that Marcus Industries had been counting on. Instead of downsizing and consolidating, my father had doubled down, taking on even more debt to pursue increasingly speculative ventures. By 2015, the company was surviving primarily on personal loans from my father, secured against the family, house, and other assets. By 2020, those resources were exhausted, and the business was being kept alive through a complex web of credit arrangements and delayed payments to suppliers. Look at this. Sarah had pointed to a particularly damning section of the records. Your father personally guaranteed millions in company debt. If Marcus Industries goes bankrupt, your family loses everything. The house, the cars, their retirement savings, all of it. I thought about my childhood, about the private schools and country club memberships, the expensive vacations and designer clothing. All of it had been funded by a company that was slowly collapsing, maintained through financial manipulation that must have consumed every waking moment of my father's life. When did the Chen family first approach them? Based on these records, about 8 months ago, right around the time your father would have realized that the business couldn't survive. Another year without a massive cash injection, the investigator had found email correspondence between my father and David Chen's uncle, William Chen, who handled the family's business investments. The initial contact had been framed as a potential business partnership, but the subtext was clear. The Chen family was looking for ways to legitimize David's inheritance claim while the Marcus family was desperately seeking financial salvation. We believe there may be opportunities for mutual benefit between our families, one email had read. David has expressed interest in both business partnerships and more personal arrangements that could serve everyone's interests. My father's response had been embarrassingly eager. We would welcome the opportunity to discuss any arrangements that could benefit both families. My daughter, Annabel, is a lovely young woman who would make an excellent wife for the right man. Reading those words, I'd felt a mixture of rage and heartbreak. My father had been shopping me around like a business asset, and I'd never even known I was for sale. There's more, Sarah had said, turning to another section of the report. The Chen family's offer was very specific about timeline and terms. The Chen family had been willing to invest $5 million in Marcus Industries, enough to cover all debts and provide working capital for future operations. In exchange, they'd wanted a marriage contract between David and me that included specific clauses about children, residence, and social obligations. Look at Clause 7. Sarah had pointed to a highlighted section. The wife agrees to produce at least 2 children within the first 5 years of marriage, to maintain residence and properties owned or approved by the Chen family, and to participate in social and business functions as required. I'd stared at the language, feeling sick. It wasn't a marriage contract, it was a breeding agreement with social obligations attached. And Clause 12, Sarah had continued. In the event of divorce, custody of all children remains with the Chen family, and the wife forfeits any claim to property or financial support. The Chen family hadn't just wanted David to marry someone. They'd wanted to ensure that any children from the marriage would remain firmly within their control, regardless of what happened to the marriage itself. My parents agreed to this. Your father signed a preliminary agreement contingent on your consent to the marriage. When you refused David's proposal, it triggered penalty clauses that would have required your family to pay damages for breach of contract. No wonder they'd been so desperate to change my mind. Refusing to marry David hadn't just cost them their financial salvation, it had potentially put them on the hook for additional financial penalties they couldn't afford to pay. How much in penalties? $2 million plus legal fees. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what I'd stumbled into. My simple decision to choose independence over an arranged marriage had unraveled a complex financial scheme that involved two families, multiple businesses, and millions of dollars. But more than that, it had revealed the truth about my family's priorities. When faced with financial ruin, they'd been willing to trade my autonomy and my child's future for business survival. The custody petition wasn't about concern for my baby's welfare. It was a last-ditch effort to salvage a deal that would save them from bankruptcy. What happens if they lose the custody case? I'd asked. They lose everything. The business fails. They declare personal bankruptcy, and they'll probably have to deal with fraud charges if anyone investigates how they've been managing the company's finances. The weight of that responsibility had settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. My family's entire future depended on forcing me into a marriage I didn't want, and my resistance was going to destroy them financially. But then I thought about Clause 12, about the children who would be trapped in that marriage contract, about the life I would have had as essentially a contracted employee in my own marriage. My family was asking me to sacrifice my autonomy and my child's welfare to cover for their poor business decisions and financial desperation. Sarah, I'd said finally, I need you to understand something. Even knowing all this, even knowing what it will cost them, I'm not changing my mind about marrying David Chen. She'd smiled the first time. I'd seen her look anything other than grimly professional during our conversations about the case. Good, she'd said, because now we have everything we need to win this custody battle and expose exactly what your family has been trying to do to you and your baby. The counter lawsuit documents were a thing of beauty, 37 pages of carefully crafted legal language that systematically dismantled my parents' custody petition while exposing the financial manipulation behind their actions. Sarah had worked on them for 2 weeks, consulting with colleagues and crafting arguments that would not only defend my rights as a mother, but also establish legal precedent against using custody battles to force unwanted marriages. We're not just responding to their petition, Sarah had explained as she'd reviewed the final draft with me. We're going on the offensive. The countersuit included 3 main components: a motion to dismiss the original custody petition as legally frivolous, a request for sanctions against my parents' attorneys for filing bad faith claims, and most importantly, a lawsuit for emotional distress and attempted coercion. Can we really sue them for trying to force me into marriage? We can sue them for using fraudulent legal claims to pressure you into a business arrangement that would financially benefit them while harming you and your child. That's not just unethical, it's potentially criminal. Sarah had structured our defense around a simple narrative. I was a competent adult making responsible choices about my pregnancy and my future, while my parents were using the legal system to try to force me into a corrupt business deal disguised as a marriage. The evidence was overwhelming. We had the investigator's report detailing the Chen family's inheritance requirements. We had business documents showing Marcus Industries' financial desperation. We had email correspondence proving that my parents had negotiated a marriage contract that treated me like property rather than a person. Most damaging of all, we had the fake eviction notice, clear evidence that my family was willing to lie and manipulate to achieve their goals. The eviction notice is going to be crucial, Sarah had said. It shows a pattern of deception and coercion that undermines every other claim they've made about your fitness as a mother. But building a legal case was only half the battle. We also needed to document my actual fitness as a parent and my ability to provide for my child. Mrs. P had appointed herself coordinator of character witnesses, creating what she called Team Annabel with military-like efficiency. She'd contacted my former clients, members of my support group, neighbors, and even my doctor to gather testimonials about my character and capabilities. We need people who can speak to different aspects of your life, she'd explained over coffee one morning. Work ethic, financial responsibility, emotional stability, commitment to your baby's welfare. Maria from the support group had agreed to testify about my volunteer work with her healthcare organization and my reputation in the nonprofit community. Dr. Patterson had written a detailed letter about my excellent prenatal care and emotional preparation for motherhood. Even my landlord had provided a statement about my reliability as a tenant and my efforts to prepare the apartment for a baby. The most surprising support had come from Marcus Jr. 3 weeks after the custody petition was filed, he'd called me for the first time since I'd moved out. "Annabel, I need to tell you something about Mom and Dad's lawsuit. I've been cautious my brother had always been loyal to the family above all else, and I'd assumed he supported their legal action. I know about the Chun family money," he'd continued. "I know about the business contracts and the inheritance requirements. I know this custody petition isn't really about you being an unfit mother. How do you know all that?" "Because Dad asked me to review the legal documents before they filed them. He wanted my professional opinion on their chances of success." "And what did you tell them?" "I told them it was legally baseless and ethically reprehensible. I told them that using custody law to force someone into marriage was potentially criminal. I told them to drop it." Marcus Jr. had paused, and I'd heard something in his voice I'd never heard before: genuine anger at our parents rather than disappointment in me. When they filed the petition anyway, I started doing my own research into what they'd gotten involved with. The Chun family contract isn't just about money, Annabelle. It's about control. If you'd married David, you would have essentially become property of the Chun family trust. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I'm going to testify for you." I'd nearly dropped the phone. "What?" "I'm going to testify that this custody petition is frivolous, that you're a competent adult making responsible choices, and that our parents are using the legal system inappropriately. Marcus, that will destroy your relationship with them." My relationship with them was destroyed the moment they decided to trade my sister's autonomy for business survival. True to his word, Marcus Jr. had provided a devastating affidavit that systematically destroyed our parents' legal arguments. As a practicing attorney, his professional opinion carried significant weight, and his willingness to testify against his own family sent a clear message about the validity of their claims. "Your brother's testimony changes everything," Sarah had said after reviewing his statement. "When a successful lawyer is willing to publicly contradict his own parents' legal strategy, it suggests that their case has no merit." We'd also gathered evidence of my financial stability and preparation for motherhood. Bank statements showing consistent savings and responsible budgeting. Invoices from freelance work demonstrating steady income. Receipts for baby clothes, furniture, and supplies showing my commitment to providing for my child. The apartment itself had become part of our defense strategy. Mrs. P had helped me photograph every corner, showing that while modest, the space was clean, safe, and thoughtfully prepared for a baby. The corner by the window where I'd planned to put the crib looked warm and inviting in the afternoon light. "The key is showing that you've made deliberate, responsible choices rather than just reacting to circumstances," Sarah had explained. "Everything from your living situation to your work arrangements to your prenatal care shows careful planning and preparation. But the most powerful element of our defense was the simplest. I was prepared to be a good mother, and I was willing to fight for my right to make that choice without interference from people who saw my baby as a solution to their financial problems." "Are you ready for what's coming next?" Sarah had asked as we'd finalized our legal response. "This is going to get ugly. Your parents are fighting for their financial survival, and they're not going to give up easily." "I'm ready," I'd said. And for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I'd meant it completely. We weren't just fighting a custody battle anymore. We were fighting for the principle that parenthood couldn't be bought and sold, that children weren't assets to be traded for business deals. and that women had the right to choose their own futures regardless of their family's financial desperation. The medical records arrived by courier on a Thursday afternoon, stamped confidential patient information and accompanied by a note from Dr. Patricia Williams, my father's longtime physician. The note was brief but devastating. I thought you should know what your father has been hiding from your family. Inside the envelope were 3 years of medical records documenting my father's struggle with a gambling addiction that had consumed not only his personal finances but had directly contributed to the collapse of Marcus Industries. The records included referrals to addiction specialists, prescriptions for anxiety medication, and detailed notes about his psychological state during what Dr. Williams had described as a progressive gambling disorder with severe financial and familial consequences. I called Sarah immediately. You need to see this, I'd said. There's more to my family's financial problems than just bad business decisions. An hour later, we'd sat in Sarah's office reviewing the medical documentation that explained everything my family had been hiding, not just from the outside world, but from each other. Records showed that my father's gambling had started small 5 years ago, casual poker games with business associates, occasional trips to the local casino. But it had escalated quickly into a compulsive behavior that had consumed increasing amounts of time and money. Look at this. Sarah had pointed to a particularly damning entry from 18 months ago. Dr. Williams documented that your father admitted to gambling away the company's quarterly profit in a single weekend in Atlantic City. The medical notes painted a picture of a man spiraling out of control while desperately trying to maintain the appearance of success. My father had borrowed against business assets to fund gambling trips, convinced that the next big win would solve all his problems. When those losses mounted, he'd started taking money from client accounts, using new contracts to pay back previous debts in an increasingly desperate cycle. This explains why the Chun family deal was so appealing, I'd said. It wasn't just about saving the business, it was about covering up years of gambling-related embezzlement, but the most shocking revelation was in the most recent medical notes. Dr. Williams had documented that my father's gambling addiction had become so severe that he'd been stealing from family accounts to fund his casino trips. My mother's inheritance from her parents, Marcus Jr.'s college fund, even money that had been set aside for my grandfather's medical care, all of it had been gambled away and replaced with IOs that my father had no way to honor. Your mother doesn't know, does she? Sarah had asked. I thought about my mother's careful composure during our confrontations about David Chen, her focus on social appearances and family reputation. She'd been fighting so hard to maintain respectability because she'd had no idea that the foundation of their life together had already crumbled. She has no idea. She thinks the business problems are just market conditions and bad luck. The medical records also revealed something else. My father's health was deteriorating under the stress of his secret addiction. High blood pressure, insomnia, panic attacks, and what Dr. Williams had described as severe depression related to guilt and financial anxiety. The man who'd built his identity around business success and family respectability was literally making himself sick trying to cover up the destruction he'd caused. There's something else you need to know, Sarah had said, turning to the final page of the medical records. Dr. Williams included a note about your father's current psychological state. The note was clinical but terrifying. Patient reports increased desperation regarding family financial situation. Has expressed willingness to consider any measures necessary to resolve current crisis. Recommend immediate intervention for both addiction treatment and suicide risk evaluation. I'd stared at the page, feeling the blood drain from my face. He's suicidal. According to his doctor, he's at risk. The shame of the gambling addiction, combined with the financial pressure and the failure of the Chen family arrangement, has put him in a dangerous psychological state. For the first time since learning about the custody petition, I'd felt something other than anger toward my parents. I'd felt fear for them. My father wasn't just a man trying to manipulate his daughter into an unwanted marriage. He was a sick man who destroyed his family's financial security through addiction and was now facing the complete collapse of everything he'd worked to build. What does this mean for our case? It means we have evidence that your parents. Legal action isn't really about your fitness as a mother. It's about covering up years of financial crimes and addiction-related losses. But it also means we're dealing with people who are truly desperate, which makes them more dangerous. Sarah had been right about the danger. 2 days after we'd received the medical records, my mother had appeared at my apartment without warning. I'd opened the door to find her standing in the hallway, looking older and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. "We need to talk," she'd said. I'd let her in, watching as she'd taken in the small space I'd been so proud of. She had sat heavily in my secondhand armchair, her perfect posture finally showing the weight she'd been carrying. "Your father told me about the gambling," she'd said without preamble. "When?" "Last night. Everything. The casino trips, the money he took from the business, the money he took from our personal accounts." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "The money he took from your college fund and paid back without telling me." I sat down across from her, seeing my mother clearly for the first time in years. Not the controlled, judgmental woman who'd been pressuring me into marriage, but a betrayed wife who'd just learned that her entire adult life had been built on lies. "Mom, I'm sorry." "Don't apologize to me," she'd said firmly. "I'm the one who owes you an apology. I've been so focused on maintaining appearances, on protecting what I thought we had, that I lost sight of what actually mattered." We'd sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the collapse of everything we thought we knew about our family. "The custody petition," I'd said finally, "we're dropping it. Today, your father wanted to continue fighting, but I won't let him use my grandchild as collateral for his mistakes." Relief had flooded through me, but it was tempered by concern for what this meant for my parents' future. "What will happen to you and Dad? I don't know. The business will probably fail. We'll likely lose the house. Your father will need treatment for his addiction, assuming he's willing to admit he needs help." Margaret Marcus had looked around my small apartment again, but this time her expression was different, not judgment, but something approaching respect. "You were right to refuse David Chun," she'd said. "You were right to choose independence over security. I should have supported your choice instead of trying to fix your father's problems at your expense." As my mother had prepared to leave, she turned back with something I hadn't seen from her in years' uncertainty. "Annabel, I know I have no right to ask this after everything we've put you through, but when the baby comes ... would you consider letting me be part of their life? Not as someone trying to control your decisions, but just as a grandmother who wants to know her grandchild. I've looked at this woman who'd raised me, who'd disappointed me, who'd tried to trade my autonomy for financial security, but who was also sitting in my apartment acknowledging her mistakes and asking for forgiveness. We'll figure it out," I'd said. "But it has to be on my terms. I understand. And Annabel, I'm proud of you. For standing up for yourself, for protecting your baby, for having the courage I never had to choose authenticity over appearances." After she'd left, I'd called Sarah to tell her about the conversation. "They're really dropping the custody petition?" "Yes, my mother promised they'd file the dismissal paperwork today." "How do you feel about that?" I considered the question carefully. Relief, certainly, but also sadness for what my family had lost and concern for what would happen to them now that their financial schemes had collapsed. "I feel like I finally understand who my parents really are," I'd said. "Not the successful, respectable people they pretended to be, but flawed humans who made terrible choices when they were scared and desperate. Does that change how you feel about them?" "It makes me sad for them, but it doesn't change my decision." to protect myself and my baby from being used to solve their problems. That evening, Mrs. P had knocked on my door with a bottle of sparkling cider and a smile. "I heard the good news from Sarah," she'd said. "Your parents dropped their lawsuit." We'd sat together on my small couch, toasting my victory with apple cider and talking about what came next. "You know," Mrs. P had said, "I've been thinking about what you said about your father's gambling addiction. Addiction is a disease, not a moral failing. That doesn't excuse what he did to you, but it might explain why he was so desperate to make the Chun family deal work. Do you think they'll be okay?" "I think they'll survive, but they'll have to build a completely different life. Sometimes that's exactly what people need, a chance to start over and do things right the second time." As I'd gotten ready for bed that night, I'd felt something I hadn't experienced in months' peace. The legal battle was over, my family's. Attempts to control my life had failed, and I was free to focus on preparing for my baby's arrival without the constant stress of fighting for my right to make my own choices. But I'd also learned something important about forgiveness. My parents had made terrible decisions that had hurt me deeply, but they'd also been trapped by their own fears, addictions, and desperate circumstances. Understanding their motivations didn't excuse their behavior, but it helped me see them as complex human beings rather than simply as villains in my story. The baby had kicked then, a strong movement that felt like agreement. We were going to be okay, not because we'd defeated our enemies, but because we'd learned to distinguish between people who loved us imperfectly and people who wanted to use us for their own purposes. The recording device was small enough to fit in my purse, barely larger than a thumb drive, but capable of capturing every word of what would become the most important conversation of my life. Sarah had insisted I carry it to any meeting with my parents, just in case they said something that revealed the true scope of their manipulation. "Even though they've dropped the custody petition," she had explained, "we still need to protect you from future legal challenges. Documentation is everything." I hadn't expected to need it when my father called 3 days after my mother's visit, asking to meet me for coffee. His voice had sounded hollow, defeated in a way I'd never heard before. "I need to explain some things," he'd said, "and I need to apologize." We'd agreed to meet at Cornerstone Coffee, the same place where I'd first met James almost a year ago. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was returning to the spot where I'd fallen in love, only to have a conversation about how my family had tried to destroy that. Happiness for their own gain. My father had arrived early and was sitting at a corner table when I'd walked in. Marcus Sr. had always been an imposing man, tall, well-dressed, radiating the kind of confidence that came from years of business success. But the person sitting across from me looked diminished, wearing a wrinkled shirt and sporting dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and mounting anxiety. "Thank you for coming," he'd said as I'd sat down. "Mom said you told her about the gambling." He'd winced at the directness of my statement. I told her everything. About the casino trips, about the money I took from the business, about how desperate I became trying to cover it all up. "How long has it been going on?" 5 years, maybe longer. It started small poker games after work, occasional trips to the track. But it escalated so gradually that I didn't realize how bad it had gotten until I was in too deep to get out. My father had explained how the addiction had consumed not just money, but his entire mental and emotional life. Every business decision had been influenced by gambling losses that needed to be covered. Every family interaction had been shadowed by the constant stress of maintaining lives that grew more complex every day. The Chun family deal seemed like salvation, he had continued. David needed a wife to claim his inheritance. We needed money to save the business, and I didn't need anything from David Chun. I'd interrupted. I was managing fine on my own. You were pregnant and alone with limited financial resources. In my mind, I was solving everyone's problems at once. In your mind, you were trading me like a business asset. The accusation had hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I thought my father might deny it or try to rationalize his behavior. Instead, he looked directly at me with an expression of complete defeat. "You're right. I convinced myself I was helping you, but really I was using you to solve problems I'd created through my own poor choices." It was the first completely honest thing he'd said to me in years, and the impact was overwhelming. This was the admission I'd been waiting for, not just that he'd made mistakes, but that he understood the fundamental betrayal of treating his daughter as a solution to his financial desperation. "The custody petition," I'd said, "was my idea. Your mother didn't want to do it, but I convinced her it was the only way to protect you from making a terrible mistake." "Protect me from making the same mistakes you made, you mean?" Yes, I was. So terrified of losing everything that I couldn't see any solution except forcing you into the arrangement I'd negotiated. My father had reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out several folded documents, copies of the contracts he'd signed with the Chun family. The financial agreements that had outlined exactly how my marriage would have solved his business problems. "I want you to see what I was willing to trade your happiness for," he'd said, sliding the papers across the table. Reading through the contracts had been like looking at an alternate version of my life, one where I would have been bound by legal agreements that controlled where I lived, how many children I had, and even what social events I attended. The financial arrangements were explicit about my role as essentially a paid employee in my own marriage, compensated through my father's business partnership rather than treated as an equal partner in a relationship. "Did you read these before you signed them?" I'd asked. "I read them, but I didn't really process what they meant for you. I was so focused on the money that would save the business that I ignored what the arrangement would cost you personally." The recording device in my purse had captured every word of his admission, creating a permanent record of my family's willingness to sacrifice my autonomy for financial gain. But sitting across from this broken man who'd once been my hero, I'd felt more sadness than anger. "Dad, why didn't you just ask for help with the gambling problem? Why didn't you tell Mom what was happening instead of trying to cover it up with increasingly desperate schemes?" Because admitting I had a problem meant admitting I'd failed. The business, the family reputation, our financial security, I built my entire identity around being successful and responsible. Acknowledging that I'd gambled away everything we'd worked for felt impossible. He'd paused, his voice breaking slightly. "I thought if I could just make the Chun deal work, I could fix everything without anyone ever knowing how badly I'd screwed up. But people were going to find out eventually. Businesses don't just recover from millions in losses without explanations." I wasn't thinking rationally. When you're in the grip of addiction, you become capable of convincing yourself that increasingly impossible solutions are not only viable but inevitable. We'd sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the weight of his admissions. Finally, my father had looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not the disappointment I'd grown up with, but something approaching respect. "You were right to refuse David's proposal," he'd said. "You were right to fight the custody petition. You were right to choose independence over the kind of security I was offering you. What happens now? Now I get help for the gambling addiction. Now your mother and I figure out how to rebuild our lives with honesty instead of pretenses. Now we face the consequences of the choices I made instead of trying to make other people pay for them." As he'd prepared to leave, my father had reached across the table and covered my hand with his. "I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness after what I put you through, but I want you to know that I'm proud of the strength you showed in standing up to us. You protected your baby and yourself from people who should have been protecting you." After he'd left, I'd sat at the table for another hour, processing everything he'd revealed. The recording device had captured not just his admissions of financial manipulation, but also something more important, a father finally acknowledging that his daughter had been right to resist his attempts to control her life. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I'd felt like I truly understood my family's motivations and could begin the process of deciding what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted to have with them moving forward. The signed custody agreement was more than just a legal document. It was a declaration of independence that established my rights as a mother and protected my child from future manipulation by people who saw her as a financial asset rather than a human being. Sarah had crafted it with the precision of someone who understood that we weren't just ending a legal battle, but establishing precedent for how families could and couldn't interfere with parental autonomy. This agreement does more than just dismiss their custody petition, Sarah had explained as we'd reviewed the final terms. It creates legal barriers against future attempts to use your child as leverage in business or personal disputes. The terms were comprehensive and, from my family's perspective, humiliating. My parents had agreed to permanently waive any claims to custody or visitation rights beyond what I voluntarily chose to allow. They'd acknowledged in writing that their custody petition had been filed in bad faith for financial rather than child welfare reasons. Most importantly, they'd agreed to pay all legal fees associated with both the original petition and our countersuit. But the real victory wasn't in the legal language, it was in what the agreement represented. For the first time in my life, I had official recognition that my choices about my own child were mine to make. Regardless of my family's opinions or financial interests, the public embarrassment had been swift and thorough. News of the dropped custody petition had spread through our social circle with the speed that only genuine scandal can achieve. The story had everything that made for compelling gossip: a prominent family's financial desperation, an arranged marriage scheme involving millions of dollars, and a pregnant daughter who'd had the courage to expose it all. "Have you seen the newspaper article?" Mrs. P had asked, appearing at my door with a copy of the local business journal. The headline read, "Marcus Industries faces bankruptcy amid gambling scandal." The article detailed my father's addiction, the failed business partnerships, and what the reporter had delicately described as alleged attempts to use family members as collateral in financial arrangements. While the article hadn't mentioned me by name, anyone familiar with the family situation could read between the lines. The Chen family's inheritance requirements, the arranged marriage proposal, and the custody battle were all referenced obliquely but clearly enough that the business community would understand what had transpired. "How do you feel about seeing it in print?" Mrs. P had asked. Relieved, I'd said, and I'd meant it. For months, I felt like I was going crazy, wondering if I was being unreasonable for refusing what everyone told me was a good opportunity. Seeing it described objectively makes it clear that I was right to resist. The business consequences for my family had been swift and devastating. Marcus Industries had declared bankruptcy within a week of the article's publication, unable to maintain operations once suppliers and clients learned about the company's financial instability. The family house had been put up for sale, and my parents had moved into a small apartment across town, a dramatic reversal of fortune. That must have felt like a complete collapse of everything they'd worked to build, but there had been unexpected positive developments as well. My father had entered a residential treatment program for gambling addiction, finally getting professional help for the problem that had driven all his desperate decision-making. My mother had filed for legal separation while he was in treatment, not out of vindictiveness, but to protect what remained of their assets from further gambling-related losses. "She is actually doing better than I expected," Marcus Jr. had told me during one of our weekly phone conversations. "Living in a smaller place, working part-time at a nonprofit, not worrying about maintaining appearances. It's like she's rediscovered parts of herself that got lost in all the social climbing." Marcus Jr. himself had been largely spared from the scandal's professional impact. since he testified against our parents' legal strategy and could demonstrate that he tried to prevent their manipulative behavior. If anything, his willingness to prioritize ethics over family loyalty had enhanced his reputation in the legal community. "Have you talked to Dad since he went into treatment?" I'd asked. "A few times. He single quotes S. different, honest in a way he never was before. The counselors say that's common when people finally stop maintaining the lies that addiction requires." The most surprising development had been David Chen's response to the whole situation. He'd called me directly 2 weeks after the custody agreement was signed, asking if we could meet for coffee. "I owe you an apology," he'd said when we'd sat down at the same cafe where my father had confessed his gambling addiction. "For what?" "For going along with an arrangement that treated you like a business asset rather than a person. For being so focused on my inheritance requirements that I didn't consider what the marriage contract would mean for your autonomy and your child's welfare." David had explained that he'd been so desperate to claim his inheritance before the deadline that he'd convinced himself the arrangement was mutually beneficial rather than exploitative. When your family's custody petition became public, I realized how terrible the whole situation looked from the outside. I was asking you to enter into what was essentially a breeding contract disguised as a marriage. What will happen with your inheritance? I'm forfeiting it. The deadline passed last month, and I chose not to pursue any last-minute alternatives that would require using another person to meet my grandfather's requirements. I'd stared at it in shock. You're giving up $47 million. I'm giving up money that I could only claim by treating someone else as a means to an end rather than as a person deserving of respect and autonomy. David had gone on to explain that losing the inheritance had been liberating in unexpected ways. Without the pressure of meeting trust requirements, he'd been free to pursue relationships based on genuine compatibility rather than legal convenience. "I'm actually seeing someone now," he'd said with a smile that looked more genuine than any expression I'd seen from him during our previous interactions. "A teacher I met through volunteer work. It's nothing like what my family planned for me, but it's real." As winter had turned to spring, I'd watched my family's public scandal transform from a source of shame into something approaching redemption. My father's completion of his addiction treatment program had been noted in the same business journal that had reported his initial downfall. My mother's work with a nonprofit serving families affected by gambling addiction had given her a sense of purpose she'd never found in social climbing. Even the Chen family had faced positive consequences from the failed arrangement. David's uncle William had been forced to explain to the family trust why their inheritance scheme had collapsed so publicly, leading to a revision of the trust requirements that eliminated the marriage and children mandates for future generations. Sometimes, Sarah had observed during our final meeting to close out the legal case, "The best thing that can happen to people is having their worst plans fail spectacularly." She'd been right. My family's attempt to solve their problems through manipulation and control had failed so completely that they'd been forced to address the real issues: addiction, financial irresponsibility, and the toxic prioritization of appearances over authenticity. But more importantly, their failure had established something crucial for my child and me: the legal and moral principle that parenthood couldn't be bought, sold, or manipulated for other people's benefit. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew that I had the law, the truth, and my own hard-won strength to protect us. The baby's first photo was taken at 6:47 a.m. on February 14th, Valentine's Day, by Mrs. P with hands that shook slightly from excitement and exhaustion. Emma Rose Marcus had arrived after 12 hours of labor, weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces, with dark hair that stuck up in impossible directions and eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with serious curiosity. "She's beautiful," Mrs. P had whispered, adjusting the tiny pink hat that the hospital had provided. And look at those hands. She's going to be an artist like her mama. I'd held Emma against my chest, feeling the weight and warmth of this little person I'd fought so hard to protect, and understood for the first time that every difficult choice I'd made over the past year had been worth it for this moment. She was mine not because of legal documents or custody agreements, but because I'd chosen to prioritize her welfare over everyone else's expectations. The labor had been intense but uncomplicated. Sarah Kim had been my birth partner, coaching me through contractions while Marcus Jr. had paced the waiting room and fielded calls from family members who weren't sure if they were welcome at the hospital. "Your mother wants to know if she can visit," he reported during one of the brief breaks between contractions. Later, I'd manage between breaths. After Emma and I have had time to bond, my mother had arrived 3 hours after the birth, carrying a small bouquet of daisies and wearing an expression of nervous hope that I'd never seen before. She'd stood in the doorway of my hospital room as if asking permission to enter her own daughter's life. "Come in, Mom," I'd said, adjusting Emma in my arms so she was visible. Margaret Marcus had approached the bed slowly, her composure cracking as she'd gotten her first look at her granddaughter. "Oh, Annabel," she'd whispered. "She's perfect." I'd let my mother hold Emma, watching as this woman who'd spent months trying to control my choices melted completely at the sight of the baby. She'd once called a shameful mistake. "I'm sorry," my mother had said without taking her eyes off Emma's face. "I'm sorry for everything we put you through. I'm sorry for prioritizing appearances over your happiness. I'm sorry for not supporting your choices from the beginning. I know, Mom. Can you forgive me?" I'd looked at my mother, really looked at her, and seen not the controlling, judgmental woman who'd tried to force me into an arranged marriage, but a grandmother holding her granddaughter with tears in her eyes and genuine remorse in her voice. "Will, figure it out," I'd said. "But it has to be different this time. No more manipulation, no more trying to control my decisions. If you want to be part of Emma's life, you have to respect that I'm her mother and I make the choices about what's best for her. I understand, and I promise." My father had visited the next day, arriving with a teddy bear and an expression of uncertainty that reminded me of the conversation we'd had at Cornerstone Coffee. Treatment had changed him. He looked healthier, more present, less consumed by the constant anxiety that had driven his desperate decision-making. "She's beautiful, Annabel," he'd said, gently touching Emma's tiny hand, "and you did an incredible job protecting her." "Thank you. I know I have a lot of work to do to earn back your trust, but I want you to know that I'm committed to being a kind of grandfather Emma deserves, not the kind of father I was to you when I was sick." The weeks following Emma's birth had been a revelation in how much life could change when you prioritized authenticity over appearances. My small apartment had been filled with visitors, Mrs. P bringing homemade meals, Sarah stopping by with legal documents to establish Emma's birth certificate and my sole custody, Maria from the support group bringing clothes that her own daughter had outgrown. My chosen family had rallied around Emma and me with the kind of unconditional support I'd always wished for from my biological family. Mrs. P had appointed herself official grandmother, teaching me how to swaddle properly and singing old songs to Emma when she was fussy. Marcus Jr. had surprised me by being a natural uncle, arriving for visits with age-appropriate toys and a genuine enthusiasm for spending time with his niece. "You know," he had said during one visit, "Emma is lucky to have you as a mother. You fought for her before she was even born, and that kind of fierce protection is exactly what kids need." The business I'd been building slowly throughout my pregnancy had taken off in unexpected ways after Emma's birth. Word had spread about my situation, a single mother who'd fought off a custody battle and established independence against significant family pressure, and I'd started receiving calls from other women in difficult circumstances who needed design work. "I heard about what you went through," one potential client had said. I'm starting a support organization for women leaving abusive relationships, and I want to work with someone who understands what it's like to choose independence over security. Within 6 months of Emma's birth, I'd built a client base of nonprofit organizations, advocacy groups, and small businesses run by women who valued resilience over respectability. The work was meaningful, the pay was adequate, and most importantly, I could do most of it from home while caring for Emma. "You've built something remarkable," Sarah had observed during one of our regular coffee meetings. "Not just a business, but a life that reflects your values rather than other people's expectations." The relationship with my parents had evolved slowly and carefully. They'd proven their commitment to change through consistent actions, attending family therapy sessions, respecting my boundaries about visits and advice, and gradually earning back my trust through demonstrated behavior rather than promises. My father's completion of his gambling addiction treatment had been a turning point. The man who'd emerged from the program was someone I'd never really known honest about his failures, committed to making amends, and focused on rebuilding relationships rather than maintaining images. "I want Emma to know her grandfather," he'd said during one of our supervised visits. "But I want her to know the real me, not the person I pretended to be when I was lying to everyone, including myself." 1 year after Emma's birth, we'd had a small birthday party in my apartment, not the elaborate celebration my parents might have thrown in their previous life, but a gathering of people who genuinely cared about Emma's welfare. Mrs. P had made a cake shaped like a teddy bear. Marcus Jr. had brought toys that encouraged creativity and curiosity. My parents had attended as guests rather than hosts, bringing modest gifts and asking permission before offering advice. As I'd watched Emma take her first tentative steps between Mrs. P's outstretched arms and her grandfather's encouraging voice, I'd understood that this was what family was supposed to look like, people who supported each other's growth rather than trying to control each other's choices. "Look at her go," my mother had said, her voice filled with pride and wonder, as Emma had taken 3 wobbly steps before sitting down hard on her padded bottom. "She's fearless," I'd replied, lifting Emma up for a congratulatory hug. "Just like her mama." That evening, after everyone had gone home and Emma was sleeping peacefully in her crib by the window, I'd sat in my small living room reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. 2 years ago, I'd been living in my childhood bedroom, hiding a pregnancy and feeling like a disappointment to everyone who mattered to me. Now I was raising a healthy, happy daughter in a home I'd chosen, surrounded by people I'd selected, doing work that reflected my values, and maintaining relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation or manipulation. The baby monitor had crackled softly with the sound of Emma's peaceful breathing, and I realized that the little girl sleeping in the next room would broke with something I'd never had the knowledge, that she was valued for who she was rather than what she could provide for other people. That was the real victory, not winning the legal battle or exposing my family's financial schemes, but creating a life where my daughter would learn that love should be unconditional, that independence is worth fighting for, and that's sometimes the bravest thing you can. Doers choose authenticity over acceptance. Outside my window, the neighborhood had settled into evening quiet, and I'd felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've chosen correctly, fought wisely, and built something worth protecting. Emma and I were going to be just fine.